All right. Hello and welcome, everybody. This is the UC Center Sacramento Speaker Series. Hello to those who are in person and also to our Zoom audience. Today we have the pleasure of hosting UC Center's Emerging Scholars for 2023. For about the last half dozen years, UC Center Sacramento has sponsored a system-wide University of California competition in which graduate students submit abstracts of their work in progress that's relevant to public policy. A selection committee reviews the applications carefully, and each year a number of winners are selected. This year we have two. And to introduce them, we have our very own graduate student researcher and teaching assistant at the center, Paige Peloton. Paige has been working with us for several years. She's a fifth-year graduate student in the Department of Political Science at UC Davis. She's a former Belinsky Fellow. She's also a graduate of the New School of Florida, which has made the news recently. Some of you may have heard about it. And we're very pleased to have her here to introduce our emerging scholars. Paige?
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 Emerging Scholars Panel. My name is Paige Peloton, and I am a teaching assistant and graduate student researcher here at the center. I'm thrilled to have you all here today for this special speaker series that features the top submissions from our Emerging Scholars Award competition. As Dr. Kravitz said, since 2017, the center has invited graduate students from across the UC system to submit their synopses of policy-relevant research. The winners are selected by a panel with the goal of promoting rigorous research that's relevant to some of the most pressing public policy topics today in California, such as climate equity and migration policy. And this year, I am honored to introduce our two awardees who have distinguished themselves through their exceptional research and commitment to public policy. From UC San Diego, we have Pascal Palahniuk, a PhD candidate with the Scripps Institution of Oceanography and the Environmental Policy Group. Prior to his time at UC San Diego, Pascal received his master's in meteorology from the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. Pascal's research focuses on climate, atmosphere, emissions, environmental equity, and transportation policy. His most recent work explores how different decision criteria in climate policy implementation influence equitable distribution of air pollution. And he has found that reducing emissions from transportation can have a significant impact on improving equity, given the deeply entrenched inequities in air quality. So thank you for being with us, Pascal. And next we have our second awardee, who is Reem Zayour, a PhD candidate in economics and a graduate student affiliate with the Global Migration Center at UC Davis. Prior to UC Davis, Reem received her master's in economics from the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. Her research lies at the intersection between labor and public economics, with a focus on evaluating the effects of migration policy and the importance of migration networks. She's particularly interested in understanding how these factors impact labor market outcomes and the integration of migrants into host economies, as you'll see later today. So congratulations again to Pascal and Reem for their outstanding achievements, and we very much look forward to hearing more about your research today. With that, please join me in welcoming Pascal to the stage.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for those really kind introductions. So my name is Pascal Palahniuk. I'm a PhD candidate at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in UC San Diego. And like they already said, I'm going to be talking about U.S. Climate policy and air quality equity. So my advisors, I'll briefly note, are joint between the Scripps Institution of Oceanography and the Public Policy School at UC San Diego. Okay, so we're going to start with the climate policy element. You may have heard of the Paris Agreement, a big international agreement to limit global climate change. A big portion of these agreements are these nationally determined contributions. These are documents submitted by each country that states what the country plans to do in order to address climate change. In the US case, they say they're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030, relative to a historic baseline. But more than just saying, these headline numbers of how much the US is actually going to reduce the total emissions, they also talk about how the US is thinking about climate change more generally. And one thing that comes up repeatedly is this idea of environmental justice and equity. So a couple quick quotes here. They say in this nationally determined contribution, NDC, that These actions will create jobs, improve public health, and help advance equity and achieve environmental justice priorities. And they say that each policy considered for reducing emissions is also an opportunity to improve equity. This is pretty strong language, right, that says this is what the US is thinking about in the context of climate policy. The question sort of becomes, well, what does that actually mean? When you go to implement climate policy, what does it mean to improve health? What does it mean to improve equity? How does that actually happen? So this is my little idealized picture of what the US economy looks like historically. You have things like cars and power plants and industrial emissions. They're emitting greenhouse gases, right? CO2 and other ones. But they're also emitting other things, air pollutants. So you have things like fine particulate matter, which I'm going to refer to as PM2.5. You have NOx, you have SO2. Some of these things form particulate matter in the atmosphere later. So these are damaging to human health in addition to the greenhouse gases. Okay, in theory, if you come up with a green economy afterwards, you're going to electrify the transportation, you're going to power them with renewable energy. Not only are you reducing the greenhouse gases, you're also reducing the other stuff, right? So this will have health benefits because you're improving air quality. Okay, so that's sort of the premise for this, and now we're going to think about the equity piece. So I'm going to define a few terms here that I'm going to use throughout. One is exposure, so exposure to PM2.5, I'm just calling that the sort of population-weighted mean of PM2.5 concentrations, basically meaning like this is the stuff that's actually in the air. And then there's disparities, so that's the percent difference between different groups. So how are different groups experiencing pollution differently? Where a disparity greater than 0 means that they're experiencing more pollution. So we're going to start small here and get big. So there's this little bar plot on the bottom with just one bar on it that says national. This shows that people of color are experiencing about 6% more PM2.5 pollution in the US nationally than the rest of the population. So that bar is going from 0 to 6, right? But we don't just need to look at this nationally. We can look at this at different spatial scales. So for example, the state scale. And remember I said everything greater than 0 means that group is experiencing more air pollution than the average. So everything to the right of the 0 line means more than the average. And basically this is showing that in almost all states, people of color are experiencing more air pollution than the population average as a whole. We can split this up further, and we can look at this by different racial categories. So here we have Asian, Black, and Hispanic, and then white all the way on the right. And basically, this is not limited to a particular group. This is pervasive, right? It's pervasive throughout a lot of different states over different racial categories. Okay, so the idea is to sort of bring this together with this climate policy idea that we're going to reduce air pollution and maybe help address this particular issue. So here's what we actually do. We start with an emissions inventory. I'm not really going to talk about this a lot, but it's not as straightforward as it might sound. But the important thing here is that there's an emission inventory of both greenhouse gases and the other pollutants, right? We need to know something about both of them. Then we're going to create some reduction pathways, which I'll talk about more in a second. So we're going to think about NDC-constrained ones, meaning that these are going to be ways that the US as a whole can reduce its emissions by 50%. So that's the constraint. We're going to meet that NDC target. And then we're going to model those emissions in this model called INMAP, and then look at what the distribution of air pollution is and what that means for disparities at the end. Okay, a little bit about these idealized pathways. This is really idealized to start with. So we're going to say what happens, for example, if we reduce all of the emissions that we're planning on reducing as part of the NDC from, for example, low-income areas, right? So we're going to look at the US, we're going to say, where are the lowest income places, and just remove all the emissions from there. So I just plotted that as a map here. The sort of purple color is removed, right? So we're going to remove all the emissions from those places, and we're not going to change any of the other places. Obviously, this is not how climate policy really works, but it tells us something about how income as a criteria could affect air pollution. And we're not just going to do that for income, we're going to do that for places with the most people of color, the most polluted places, so the places with the highest air pollution, the places where they would be cheapest to reduce emissions, and then equally where we're not doing this criteria, we just do sort of a across-the-board cut. The this is what that looks like. So the y-axis here is total exposure to PM 2.5. And the black bar is sort of the comparison point, right? This is the current state before we do modifications, and then the colored ones are after modification. And what you'll notice is that the total exposure goes down, right? So before we even think about equity, just think about how is air pollution changing? Well, it decreases, which makes sense because we're decreasing emissions here. Another thing to note is that it decreases a little bit more in the PM 2.5 exposure one. That's the dark blue line. And basically that's saying, okay, we're going to reduce pollution from the most polluted places first. Well, that has the most national benefit in terms of pollution. Also sort of makes sense. Now there's going to be a whole bunch of bars here about the national disparity. So again, we're going to compare the black line to the colored lines. The black bar is the unmodified case, so that's the current status. And then the colored ones are how they change in these different idealized priorities. So what I'm going to point out here is the light blue one. Let's see, maybe I can get a pointer here. This light blue bar here is the one where we reduce emissions most from the places with the most people of color. And that has the biggest reduction in these disparities. So using that as a criteria has the biggest effect. The other thing I'll note is that although some of these bars decrease, some of them increase compared to the black bar, right? So basically this is saying that reducing inequities as a result of climate policy is not a guarantee. Depending on how you change these emissions, you might actually increase the disparities. For example, in our case, in the income and the least cost case, you actually increase the disparities. Okay. Like I said, this is very idealized, removing a lot of emissions from some places and no emissions in others. So we're going to expand this a little bit and say, what happens if we randomize this? Okay, so this is still not really a realistic policy implementation because it's, making these actual decisions on a local level is very complicated, but we're going to say, let's relax this assumption of just removing all from one place and none from another, and just pick counties throughout the country and start removing emissions. And we can do this a lot of times, which gives us some variation and see what happens. So these different sectors, these are the 4 sectors that we're considering: electricity, transportation, residential, and industry. And for each of these industries, we're going to start removing, and we're still going to meet that national target, but now randomly instead of with one really fixed criteria. Okay, I'm going to set up the plot here, start with a schematic. I'm going to plot some things like this. These are disparities on the x-axis and number of states on the y-axis, right? So let's say in this particular example, this group, in most of this is like the first big plot where the big group, many states are experiencing a positive disparity, meaning more people of color are affected, few are not. And we're just going to plot this as a distribution. And so I'm going to take away the bars. And then we're going to start doing this randomized policy implementation, and we're going to see how this distribution changes. So you could imagine that when you randomly reduce emissions, maybe you're going to shift this distribution, and the disparities will be higher than they were before. You could also imagine that they sort of become centralized around 0, so you're removing these disparities. Or maybe they just sort of stay the same. And the cool thing is that we can do this a bunch of times and sort of get a variation in how climate policy might be implemented. This is what it actually looks like when we do this. These are the distributions. So the red line is white populations, and the colored lines are the different groups. And what you'll notice is that they all tend to be shifted to the right of 0. And all those random lines are basically on top of the dashed line, right? They don't really change that much. So this is sort of saying that when we randomly implement these climate policies, we're not really having much of an effect on these disparities. One thing worth remembering here, though, is that instead of plotting disparities here, I'm plotting exposures, so the actual amount of pollution experienced. And what you'll notice is that the pollution does decrease, and that's worth keeping in mind. So the project is focused on disparities, which is relative pollution experience, but the total pollution does decrease, so there's definitely still a public health benefit of reducing emissions. I don't want that to get drowned out in this focus on equity. And then lastly, we plot sort of how the disparity changes as a function of changing transportation emissions. And the point here is that there's sort of this divide between this red curve and the non-red curve. And what you notice is that as we change the fraction, as we remove a larger fraction of transportation emissions, you get a disproportionate benefit in disparities. So even though on average, these randomizations, we didn't see a clear pattern in reducing disparities, we do see that when we look at reducing transportation emissions specifically. So because we have these different randomizations, in some randomization, there's going to be a case where we reduced a lot of transportation emissions, and there's going to be some cases where we didn't. And so you can sort of tease apart in which cases is there a big change and in which case is there not a big change. And transportation is one sector that really stood out as having disproportionate air quality benefits when there's a larger reduction. Okay, so that wraps up what I have to say. Basically, to sum up, there are large existing pollution disparities. This is widely documented already. We just show it in another new way. These disparities could get better depending on how you implement greenhouse gas reduction policies. So focusing on places with more people of color had a larger impact, but it is definitely not guaranteed. So when we focused on cost or income as a priority, the disparities actually went up. And the overall reduction isn't huge, but transportation as a sector holds disproportionate potential in reducing these air quality disparities. Okay, thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be presenting to a policy-oriented audience, and I look forward for the discussion afterwards. So my name is Reem. Today I will be talking about the impact of the deferred action of childhood arrivals on the undocumented immigrants in the US labor market. But before I do that, I will give a brief snapshot on the undocumented population in the US. And these are facts that I obtained from the current population survey, the ASTAC supplement for the years 2019 and 2020. So the undocumented population reached its peak in 2012, and that was almost 12.2 million individuals. Since then, it has been decreasing. And in 2019 and 2020, there were almost 10.2 million undocumented individuals in the US. These constitute 30% of the foreign-born population, but only 4.4% of the total employed working-age population in the US. And this is a relatively young population, so the average age is 40 years old compared to 49 years old for documented immigrants. Regarding their educational profile, most of them have low education levels, so 33.8% drop out of high school, and 27.4% only have a high school degree. They do not have formal job access or access to welfare benefits and credit, and they are excluded from federal safety net programs like Medicare and stimulus checks during the pandemic. And although they do not have formal access to the job market, their labor supply is quite high. So their employment rate is 68.8%. And if you only look at males, it's 82.4%. That's higher than the male native employment rate and the male documented immigrants employment rate. Almost 3 out of 4 employed undocumented individual works in a sector that was deemed essential during the pandemic. So these are sectors like healthcare social workers, food preparation workers, etc. And unfortunately, these are lower wage jobs. So they cluster in jobs that pay less than other jobs. And I have a figure here that shows the share of undocumented workers in select essential occupations. In some of these, undocumented workers make 50% of the total workers. And since they cluster in these lower wage jobs, that makes them more vulnerable to economic shocks or health crises and economic recessions. And that's what we can see here. So in this figure, which is from a report I co-authored with my advisor, Giovanni Peri, and the Center for American Progress. We show the employment rate difference in each month from its value in December 2019. And we show that for 3 different groups: the US-born population, the documented immigrants population, and the undocumented immigrants. That is in dark red. And what we can see here is that between March and April 2020, so at the beginning of the pandemic, the undocumented immigrants are the fastest to lose their jobs. Their employment rate has a sharp decrease relative to December 2019. It's almost a 16% decrease in employment rate. But at the same time, we can see that they are the population that experience the fastest recovery. So because they don't have access to welfare or stimulus checks, their only way forward is to find jobs, right? So that's why we see a very fast recovery. And by December 2020, they have the smallest gap from December 2019 relative to the 2 other groups. And then moving forward, so as the economy started recovering from the pandemic, another issue that was facing the US labor market is the labor shortages, right? So a lot of job vacancies that are not filled. So in another report, also with Giovanni Peri, we check the correlation between relying on foreign-born workers and the rates of unfilled jobs by industry. And what this is showing here is that in industries that historically relied on immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, such as construction, food and accommodation, leisure and hospitality, these are the services that see a higher rate of unfilled jobs or higher vacancies. And that is closely related to the fact that migration came to a halt during the pandemic, right? So industries that relied more on migrants had higher job openings. So what does this mean moving forward is that we have a population that has a very high employment rate, especially in industries where there are a lot of job vacancies and that are essential, but at the same time, they are most vulnerable to economic shocks, recessions, and crises. So the way moving forward is immigration policy, right? Policies that can basically limit the negative effects on undocumented immigrants, but at the same time, use the most of their potential. So during the last 2 years, since Biden took office, there has been some proposals to reform the migration system, but unfortunately, it did not reach anywhere. So that makes the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 the last legalization reform that occurred in the US. After that, there were some small amnesties focusing on small groups, but the IRCA was the largest one. So today I will focus on the most recent executive action in that regard, which is the Deferred Action of Childhood Arrivals that was passed in 2012. That executive action was passed by President Obama, and since then, almost 826,000 individuals have benefited from DACA. And it basically gave 3 major benefits for undocumented immigrants. The first one was work authorization. Second was deferred action of removal. And the third was social security numbers, which gave them access to loans and credits. But it's very important to note that this action was only temporary, so it did not provide any pathway to citizenship or lawful status. And that made it very vulnerable to cancellation or susceptible to risk of cancellation, which was pretty obvious during the Trump administration, right? So the administration challenged that policy so much. As for President Trump specifically, he did not show a consistent view on DACA. Towards the beginning of his administration, he would refer to documented individuals as absolutely incredible kids, and he claimed that the administration will show great heart. But towards 2018, 2019, he would refer to them as far from angels and hardened criminals. But the situation legally reached a climax in September 2017. That's when the Trump administration decided to suspend the program or rescind it. In reaction, 15 states, including California, Washington, and New York, sued to block the recession. So federal court judges ordered the continuation of the program. What that led to is individuals who were granted DACA before 2017 could retain its benefits, but there were no new applications considered after that. Since then, in June 2020, the Supreme Court blocked DACA's repeal, saying it was unwarranted, but it also assured that in the future it could be canceled if only done in a legally proper way. So it's still not set in stone that the program will continue. So what I do in my research is I ask, what are the consequences of the increased uncertainty ensued by the Trump administration on the benefits of DACA? In particular, I focus on the effects of DACA between 2012 and 2019 on employment, education, and occupational mobility. And I also focus on varying expectations towards a temporary policy like DACA on its outcomes. To answer the question, I utilize data from the American Community Survey. That's publicly available data. I look at years 2005 to 2019. This data is representative of the US population, but it does not ask individuals whether they are undocumented or not, right? So what I do is I use a residual method where first I identify the foreign-born population in the data, and then I identify individuals who are likely documented. These are people who have access to welfare, work in occupations that we don't see usually undocumented immigrants working in. And then the remainder population is considered likely undocumented. And then I determine whether they are eligible for DACA or not, because DACA had 4 main requirements. Having lived in the US since 2007, the 2012 is a typo, entered the US before the age of 16 and before 2007, the individual should have been under 31 years old as of June 2007, and there was also an education requirement. The individual should be in school or have graduated from high school. And then after I determine the eligible individuals, I can compare those who are eligible to those who are not before and after DACA to see the impacts of the policy. And I separate the period that's after DACA into 2012 to 2016. That's when individuals were certain that DACA can have benefits. And then after 2017, when even eligible individuals are not sure whether the program is going to continue. And I also control for race, Hispanic ethnicity, sex, years of education, and marital status. So these are my main results. First, between 2012 and 2016, I find that the policy had significant positive impacts on employment of undocumented individuals, and that is consistent with the literature. So I find that the likelihood of employment increased by 5.13 percentage points, and that is driven by a 4.11 percentage point increase in the likelihood of participating in the labor force, and a 1.65% reduction in the likelihood of unemployment. At the same time, I see that individuals are not attending school as much as before, maybe now because they have work authorization, so they're joining the labor market. However, after 2017, all these positive effects on employment cease to exist. They disappear. There are no significant effects of the policy after 2017. But at the same time, there's an even higher decrease in the likelihood of being in school or education. So another important avenue is to note that not all populations, not all eligible populations were able to benefit from DACA in the same way. So there might be institutional factors or network effects that are deciding who benefits from DACA and how much. So in my paper, I look at the differential effects of the policy by Hispanic ethnicity and gender. But now for the purpose of time, I'm only going to focus on the differential effects by political environments. So what I do here is I compare the effects of DACA in Republican states versus those in Democratic states. And the idea is generally Democratic states have provided a safety net for undocumented immigrants, while Republican states, even at the state level, usually try to restrict them through their laws. So what I find is that between 2012 and 2016, there are highly significant effects of the policy on the labor market outcomes in Republican states as well as Democratic states. But they are higher in Republican states, the effects. But after 2017, the effects persist in Democratic states, but they disappear in Republican states, which shows the chilling effects of the policy in these states. And this has important policy implications because it shows that the federal law is also interacting with the state environments. So state environments are crucial. They affect how much benefits recipients can actually derive from the policy. So we can take the example of California. In the state of California, undocumented immigrants have access to driver's licenses. They are also granted in-state tuition eligibility, and the state has tried to uphold DACA after the Trump administration tried canceling it. So in a state like California, we expect the effects to persist after 2017, even if there's federal uncertainty whether the program is going to be canceled or not. So to conclude, undocumented individuals have showed how critical they are during the pandemic. They were running food supply chains. They provide childcare, supporting medical systems, yet they were not excluded from aid and recovery efforts, making them a quite vulnerable population. What I show is that a temporary policy like DACA has positive effects on employment of individuals, but the effects mostly disappear after 2017 when the policy faces uncertainty and risk of cancellation. So this has important policy implications as it shows that temporary policies can be volatile and susceptible to external factors. And these factors should be taken into account when we are doing a cost-benefit analysis of such policies, because it's not only about the individuals, it's about where they are and what other local factors they are facing. And that's basically it for me. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for two outstanding presentations, and thank you again for two outstanding presentations. And in recognition of your achievements, I'm very happy to present to each of you a certificate of award from UC Center Sacramento, Reem and Zahur. And then I have a question or two to open things up with. Pascal, I was trying to understand the finding about transport being the most effective lever for reducing disparities, and I wondered if you could elaborate on that. And then Reem, after he's done, I'd like to hear from you about the negative effects of DACA on education, because when we discuss social determinants of health, for example, we know that years of education are actually the most powerful predictor of future life flourishing, including health. So I'm wondering, that was a finding that was surprising to me, so I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. So please.
Is this mic good? Okay. Yeah, so in terms of transportation being an avenue towards improved equity in terms of air quality, I think I'm branching out into things beyond my own paper here, but I think the core of it is that these freeways were built intentionally through communities of color historically. And I think there's basically no way around that, right? Currently our infrastructure is set up in a way that just disproportionately impacts communities of color. That's true for a lot of different infrastructure, but cities are places that are, highly populated, tend to have more people of color, and I think those on-road emissions specifically are just running through communities of color. I think that's probably the most straightforward explanation of what's going on. It's just more localized, more acute than something that's more diffuse. Like maybe a power plant is located somewhere outside of a city, it gets spread out more. It still tends to be located more in communities of color, but I think transportation is just, the proximity is so high. Yeah.
As for the education effects of DACA, so I think it's important to note that the population that I am using in my study is an adult population. So these are individuals who are getting basically more education than they need just because they don't have a work authorization. But once they get the work authorization, they get a job. However, if we look at the effects of DACA on the young population, their education actually increases. So they do get high school degrees. Some of them complete more years of education in colleges. But in my study, I'm looking at people who sometimes are 30 years old, so they don't need to be in school anymore. They got their education, and now, because of the work authorization, they move to the job market. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you both so much for those fantastic presentations today. These will be actually available on our UCCS website, the recording as well as the presentation slides. And thank you so much for joining us here in person as well as on Zoom.